Is he here? Dr. Michael Oren is the Deputy Minister in the Prime Minister's Office and Special Envoy responsible for developing and strengthening Israel's diplomatic relations with regard to economic and national security prospects. He's a member of Knesset of Kulanu, the Kulanu party. He served on the Foreign Affairs, Defense and Constitutional Committees and chaired the Special Subcommittee on Foreign Relations that dealt with Israel's most sensitive international issues. Deputy Minister Oren has served as Israel's ambassador to the United States, during which he was, for our purposes, very interestingly, he was instrumental in obtaining U.S. defense aid, especially for Iron Dome. Of course, Dr. Oren is a noted author. His last 3 books have all appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. Far too many awards to mention, especially given the time constraints. The only one I'll mention, most of them you can guess, but one I was not aware of, a gold medalist Maccabi athlete. Your bio didn't say which sport though, so rowing, okay. Great. So with that, let me invite Deputy Minister Oren up to give a few remarks.
God, I love when they mention my rowing career. I came in second yesterday. I'm trying to relive the glories of my youth. Good morning, Boker Tov. CYBERWEEK, huh? It's like not every day is CYBERWEEK. Believe me, it's CYBERWEEK. Listen, here's my opportunity to actually put on a different hat. Because before I was in politics, before I was in diplomacy, I was an historian. I'm not allowed to hawk my books by law in Israel, but I wrote a book some years ago about the Six-Day War. It's available at famously reduced prices now. If you go on Amazon, they'll probably pay you to actually order it. So I'm going to bring you back in history to June 5th, 1967. Everybody know what happened on that day? Little day. It's the day that Israel began a war, which would later become known as the Six-Day War. Nobody knew there was going to be 6 days at that point. And Israel went to war on the morning of June 5th, 1967, with an army, the IDF, that was equipped with French arms. French tanks, Belgian guns for the most part, no American planes, no American tanks. There were a few World War II surplus tanks. But the United States didn't provide Israel any military aid. There was no strategic alliance between Israel and the United States in June 1967, contrary to a very widespread popular misconception that somehow this strategic alliance went back to Israel's creation in 1948. Very much on the contrary. Starting with President Truman, the United States effected a military boycott of the state of Israel. Now, this military boycott did not affect other armies in the Middle East. In fact, our principal adversaries on the Eastern Front were the Jordanians. And the Jordanians had 100 M60 Patton tanks, which was the largest tanks in the entire area, and Israel had nothing that could stop the M60 tanks. And it was actually on the morning of June 6th that when the Jordanian tanks began to move from Jericho towards Jerusalem, that is when Israel brought the paratroopers up from Sinai to defend Jerusalem against the M60 American tanks moving on Jerusalem. People forget this. The only weaponry Israel received prior to June 5th, 1967 were Hawk missiles, which were given by President Kennedy to David Ben-Gurion back in 1962 as an incentive to try to get Israel to limit the scope of the Dimona reactor. That worked. But these were purely defensive weaponries, and nothing that could be used to actually defend Israel in an offensive capacity. So Israel went to war on the morning of June 5th with French weaponry and opposed by the Johnson administration. Again, a popular misconception that the U.S. administration was behind the Six-Day War. It was not. Johnson vigorously opposed it. And there were incidents that occurred during the war which deepened that opposition. 3 days after the war started, June 8th, the Liberty incident, when Israeli torpedo boats and jet planes attacked an American spy ship, the Liberty. not too far south from here, by accident, completely by accident, but it definitely deepened these rifts. It followed the following day on June 9th when Israeli forces attacked the Golan Heights and became very close to hurling the United States into a face-to-face confrontation with the USSR. All of this would not seem to augur the initiation of a deep and far-reaching strategic alliance between Israel and the United States. Now, before this time, the United States and Israel had what you might call friendly relations. And the relations had two pillars. One pillar, believe it or not, was a spiritual pillar. The United States was, and to a large extent remains today, the most religiously observant of all modernized nations, of all industrialized nations. More Americans go to church every week than in any other country, believe it, certainly more than this country, but certainly in European countries. People in America read their Bible. The Bible says God loves Israel. Therefore, Americans, if they're religious Christians, tend to love Israel as well. That's the basis of the evangelical support for Israel. In addition, there were the shared democratic values, which to this day still remain an important pillar in our relationship. The fact that we have representative government, we still have an independent judiciary. The fact that that same President Kennedy, after he was assassinated in 1963, had a memorial built to him outside of Jerusalem. It's the only place in the Middle East. In 1968, Israel would build a memorial to Martin Luther King, the only place in the Middle East. Unfortunately, after 9/11, there's also a memorial to 9/11, the only place in the Middle East. But prior to 1967, no Israeli prime minister had ever visited the White House. This notion that Israeli prime ministers go to Washington, they walk into the White House, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. David Ben-Gurion, the founder of this country, was never in the White House. President Kennedy agreed to meet with him, and I mean barely agreed to meet with him, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York. Imagine that today. So it's not that this strategic alliance was understood. All of that changed, one might say, on the seventh day of the Six-Day War. On that seventh day, American policymakers woke up in the morning and said, whoa, there's this little pro-American, pro-Western powerhouse in the Middle East that just defeated several Soviet-backed militaries, the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Iraqis, and maybe, perhaps, I just spilled the water that you left conveniently on the edge of this, maybe we should be allied with that country. Maybe we should have a strategic alliance with the state of Israel. And that began slowly. It didn't happen overnight. It began with the sale of tanks. It followed with the sale of Phantom jets. Phantom jets were a major step in that relationship. And the reason was not because the United States was committed in any sentimental way to Israel. It had to do with the Cold War. Israel was perceived as an ally of the United States and the West in the Cold War against the Soviet bloc, because these Arab armies, for the most part, were armed with Soviet weaponry. Nixon thought of Israel purely in that way. This is our great anti-Soviet ally in the Middle East. Alexander Haig had that famous line, Israel is our greatest aircraft carrier in the Middle East. We're an aircraft carrier. It's not so much about, being a strong sort of emotional attachment to this land. That approach reached its height in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when the Soviets airlifted resupplies to the Syrian Egyptian armies, and the United States begrudgingly, Henry Kissinger opposed it, airlifted supplies to the state of Israel. And then followed the first major aid packages over the course of the 1970s. But still, the United States held Israel at an arm's length strategically. People forget that when Israeli jets bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, President Reagan not only joined with the Iraqis in condemning Israel in the Security Council, he also ordered a boycott, a freeze on the supply of F-16 jets to Israel. Imagine that today. The relationship did not improve with the Jonathan Pollard spy affair, which continues to plague us in one way or another to this day. That was in 1986. And then in 1991, the Gulf War. It was the first time U.S. troops were placed on Israeli soil, actually not far from here, just above this campus, to operate Patriot anti-missile batteries, because the Iraqis had hit us with some 40 Scud missiles. But Israel was under tremendous pressure from the first Bush administration not to enter the war, and we buckled to that pressure, frankly. Actually took notes in that meeting between Dick Cheney and our chiefs of staff, and tremendous pressure put on us. And at the end of the war, there was no appreciation expressed for it whatsoever. As a reward, we got the Madrid Peace Conference. We were put under pressure to give up territory for peace. Maybe not the worst idea, but it was framed in the form of pressure. There was no reward for that whatsoever. The strategic alliance really evolved rather belatedly over the course of the 1990s. There's a theory out there. Those of you who are into theories may know the Walter Mearsheimer theory of the Israel lobby that says that the United States establishes this deep strategic alliance and gives military aid to Israel, the largest military aid package which the United States gives to any foreign country, as a result of the impact of the Israel lobby, which is sort of a euphemism for AIPAC. But the theory is exactly the opposite. It's got it exactly wrong. AIPAC existed since the 1970s. It was never powerful until the strategic alliance began to evolve. AIPAC's power is a direct result of the strength of the alliance, not vice versa. So Israel gets the largest aid package in military history. It's important to note that the aid package doesn't mean that the United States aids Israel militarily than it does other countries. The United States actually gives far more military assistance to Germany and South Korea than it does to Israel, but we have the only package that is actually called an aid package. Those other expenditures are included under the defense budget of the United States. It's also important to note that 75% of that aid is spent in the United States. It's basically a subsidy for the American arms industry as well. And under the new memorandum of understanding signed between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, ultimately 100% of that aid will be spent in the United States. But the aid, is important to remember, is extended because it's also a primary American interest. Now, everybody in Washington understands this. That's why there's never a big debate about the aid. Not only is it most of it spent in the United States, but it also gets, through the aid, America gets the benefits of Israeli military technology and the improvements that are made on American systems by Israelis. There's the benefits of Israeli intelligence, and the U.S.-Israel intelligence relationship is virtually unparalleled in the world. There are joint maneuvers. I say this with mixed pride. In 1990, I participated as an Israeli officer in the first joint maneuver, Juniper Cobra 1. All right? Colonel, how many Juniper Cobras? What are we up to now? Every year. Is every year? No, it used to be every 2 years. Okay, so you're here every other year. What are we up to now? That's scary to hear this. Like, something like that. It's like 18, 19 Juniper Cobra. It started off with a bunch of officers sitting around the table passing notes to one another. Now it's a huge maneuver involving hundreds and hundreds of people. In addition to the joint maneuvers, you get, listen, it's American equipment being used by the Israeli military. It's being tried in battle. And that's a great benefit. And it's a very good advertisement for U.S. material as well. And the last reason, and I think this is in many ways the biggest reason, is that Israel among Americans remains very, very popular. In fact, our popularity among Americans is going up all the time. In the last year alone, it's gone from 71 to 74% of Americans define themselves as pro-Israel as one way or another. So that aiding Israel politically, particularly for members in Congress, is a very good deal. So the alliance tightened. And it tightened up to the end of the Cold War. And remember, that was the raison d'etre, the fact that Israel was an ally of the United States against the Soviet bloc, and then one night the Soviet bloc disappeared. So you figured that the alliance would lose its raison d'etre. But very shortly after, historically speaking, the United States embarked on another war, which back then originally was called the War on Terror, starting on September 11th, 2001. It's assumed different names over the course of the last 17 years. War against violence extremism, war against Islamic extremists. But again, Israel and the United States find themselves fighting on the same side. Now, Israel had amassed an immense amount of experience in fighting terror, and we shared this experience with the United States. Israeli companies were involved in supporting the war effort in Iraq and Afghanistan. There was one little kibbutz up north, Sasa, founded by Americans, by the way, in 1949, that came up with a do-it-yourself overnight armoring kit that actually, someone knows it? You know this one? You're from Sasa? Kol hakavod. You want to tell them about it? Armored thousands of vehicles. 40,000 vehicles. Amazing. For the United States. America showed up in Iraq and Afghanistan with Humvees and other vehicles that were not armored. And they had to armor them very quickly. And I used to get all the thank you notes from you, by the way, from Americans whose kids were saved, grandkids were saved, husbands were saved by our technology. Most American combat troops, infantrymen, carry an Israeli-made high-tech bandage that's made by a startup in Jerusalem. Every American combat pilot, whether it be a fixed-wing pilot or a helicopter pilot, wears an Israeli-made helmet. American destroyers, naval destroyers carry an Israeli-made gun, cannon. I mean, it goes on and on, the depth of this relationship. And then there was a systems development. You mentioned the Iron Dome. I had the honor of bringing the aid for Iron Dome as well as for David Sling. These were, the Iron Dome is the first, it's Israeli technology with American backing. David Sling is a joint U.S.-Israel project. Arrow 2, Arrow 3 are joint U.S.-Israel projects. This is the most advanced, multi-layered aerial defense system in the world. It is the only one that has actually been tried in battle and proved 92, if not more, % effective, certainly in the case of Iron Dome. David Sling is the first effective system that can interdict a cruise missile, a precision-guided missile. The Arrow 2, Arrow 3 are for suborbital and orbital missiles. And then there's the F-35, the strategic fighter, which Israel will become the first air force in the world to completely outfit with the F-35, and it is, thanks to an interesting photograph that appeared some weeks ago, it is the first F-35 jet to be used in combat. Now that is a very good piece of advertisement for the F-35, which is a rather pricey piece of equipment. Our biggest field of cooperation today, though, is in cyber. Cyber, cyber, cyber. Israel accounts for 0.02% of the world population. We are over 20% of the world's investment in cyber. That means we're punching some 200 times above our weight in terms of cyber. Our cyber capabilities are perhaps not those of the United States, perhaps maybe not those of China, but we're up there, certainly with England. We have developed a major cyber center, and maybe you're probably going to visit those who are visiting from overseas down in Beersheba. And it is an immense part of our defense outlay today and our strategic thinking also. We really think of terms of air, ground, sea, and cyber as an additional wing of our military. If those of you have time to read an interesting article by David Sanger of the New York Times that appeared last night, it talks about 2 major cyber attacks launched against the United States and America's reticence to use its defense against these cyber attacks, lest the technology of the defense be exposed to the attackers. Gives you an idea of the type of dilemmas we're facing in the cyber field. Beyond that, what began on June 13th, 1967, the day after the Six-Day War, has expanded into the deepest, most multifaceted strategic and defense alliance which the United States has known with any foreign power in the post-World War II period. It has expanded to areas that you're not necessarily thinking about on a daily basis. Defense technology, starting with the previous administration, Janet Napolitano, of the Chief of the Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security in the Obama administration, would come here regularly to look at our fences, to see how we're defending our borders. Now we've expanded to anti-tunnel technology, and Israel, of course, is a world leader on that. Airport defense. American defense officials are always looking at our airport and looking about how our airport security, which is extraordinary, and if you ever get a chance to do a behind-the-scenes tour of Ben Gurion Airport, behind the scenes, it is amazing. Not all of our lessons are applicable to the United States, but they can learn a lot from us. There are deep exchanges between the U.S. and Israeli police forces, FBI, anti-terror squads, special forces training goes on here. And again, the cyber and computer intelligence capabilities, Israel has thwarted at least 30 major terrorist attacks in recent years, including an attempt to blow up an Australian airliner. Many of these terrorist attacks are of the caliber, the dimensions of the Paris attacks, very large attacks that were prevented by Israel. There are, of course, many future challenges. And one of the big problems we're dealing with in cyber, and I don't think I have to tell you this, is because we don't know the nature of the threat entirely. It's very difficult to develop effective defenses. We are a moving target. They're moving targets. We're doing our best, but we're the world's leaders. We are working together to secure our ports and other termini. We are working together to stop terror before it happens. You know, in the Knesset, I host a tremendous amount of sort of an endless procession of world leaders, and particularly of other parliamentarians. Recently, I had a delegation from France, of French senators, and they were curious. They couldn't understand how we managed to fight terror so well on one hand and preserve our democracy. They actually saw a contradiction here. And one senator asked me a question that stuck with me, sticks with me to this day. She says, "Where are your troops?" And I looked at him, I said, qu'est-ce que c'est ça? What do you mean by this? And he said, well, if you go to Paris, if you go to Brussels, there are, tanks out in the street. There are people in full battle gear out there. We don't see that on your streets. And our response to the French senators was, if there are troops on the street, that's a sign that you have failed already. Because what can a man with a gun do on a street if there's a terrorist attack? It's a sign that you've already prevented. Preventing terror begins 5 steps before that. And yes, it begins with community relations, it begins with human intelligence, but ultimately it's about cyber, it's about computer intelligence. We face immense challenges in the enemies that are confronting us. Interesting, about a week ago, there was an article published in the paper, a response of the U.S. military to a report by Amnesty International that U.S.-led coalition forces in the battle for Raqqa in Syria had killed hundreds, maybe thousands of civilians while fighting Islamic State. And the response of the U.S. military spokesman, Colonel Ryan, was interesting. He said, it's very difficult to fight against an enemy that is dressed in civilian garb and using the local population as human shields. And it makes collateral damage almost inevitable. Does that sound familiar to anybody? I wanted to take him on for the IDF spokesman because we basically issue the same statement every single week. It shows that we're facing very similar challenges and grappling with them. We deal with an enemy that does not necessarily have a military strategy. It has a media and diplomatic and legal strategy. And the rockets in Hezbollah, in the hands of Hezbollah and Hamas, yes, they're designed to hurt us, but they can't destroy us. They know they can't destroy us, but what they're designed to do is get us to strike back and kill their civilians. And our next battles don't end on the battlefield. They don't end in Gaza. They don't end in southern Lebanon. Our next battlefields end in The Hague. And that's precisely where our enemies want to take us, and for which, frankly, we are not prepared. We're prepared militarily. We are not prepared diplomatically. We're not prepared in terms of our media strategy, and we're certainly not prepared legally. And what we need, in addition to our military Iron Dome, is a legal and diplomatic Iron Dome that's going to prevent us from grappling with the greatest threat of all, and that is delegitimization, the attempt to deny us the right to defend ourselves, and ultimately deny us the right to exist. For the last year and a half, it has been my distinct displeasure to have to deal with the Gaza situation. The Israeli government asked me to look at the humanitarian situation in Gaza and to devise different ways of alleviating it. We could not. You should know that we do not have a naval blockade of Gaza. Those are people who do. We have a naval blockade which is approved by the UN, which only interdicts weapons and dual-use commodities that can be used as weapons. We don't interdict food. We don't interdict medicine. We don't interdict clothing, children's toys. All of that's a myth. We had 3 open crossings into Gaza, the only 3 crossings into Gaza. Hamas either dug tunnels under them or shelled them or burnt them. Okay, this is Hamas wants to starve out its own population. It wants to use its own population as hostages and to exact concessions from the world in return for this. So there's very little we can do about Gaza. And we also have domestic politics. They have 4 of our citizens, 2 soldiers who have probably deceased and 2 living soldiers, and the Israeli population is not in the mood exactly to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza. A very difficult situation. And even today, where I have visited in the last couple of weeks twice the area around Gaza to see the extensive damage inflicted by these fire kites, these flying, they're actually basically flying fire bombs, have laid to waste some 15,000 dunams there, cost us countless millions of shekels, destroyed nature reserves. This morning it was reported that our Air Force struck the car of the man who has been responsible for many of these flying terror bombs. And we often get accused in the UN of disproportionate and indiscriminate firing at Palestinian at Palestinian demonstrators in the Gaza Strip, to my mind, this is a disproportionate response. This man has caused us millions and millions and millions of shekels of damage, wrecked lives, wrecked communities, and we took out what? We took out his car? I don't quite get that. Tremendous, tremendous challenges. As we've seen in the UN, where Israel was accused of firing indiscriminately at Palestinian mediators, Palestinian demonstrators, I leave you with one thought, okay? It's not a pleasant one, so brace yourself. The demonstrator is the new missile. It's the new missile. It's, the demonstrator not only can be, in most cases, used many times again where a missile can't, but a demonstrator is not going to bring about an Israeli military response on Gaza in a large extent. We're not going to lay waste headquarters or bases because of a demonstrator. But the demonstrator is designed to get to the fence and to get shot. That's what Hamas wants. It wants it to be recorded. It wants Israel to be defamed in the international media. It wants that media strategy to translate immediately into diplomatic pressure. And all that media focus on the on what occurred in Gaza and those successive Fridays of demonstrations only encouraged Hamas further to send more kids to the fence. The recent decision by the UN General Assembly, which accused Israeli soldiers of firing indiscriminately and disproportionately at Gaza, that is the greatest message they can give to Hamas to keep it going. They think they're doing a favor for the Palestinians. They're doing just the opposite. As far as I'm concerned, anybody who voted for that resolution will have that responsibility on their hands. I wish you a very good conference. I think what you're doing is extremely important. I've talked about our relationship with the United States this morning. Of course, there are many other relationships. Our relationship, the one that began on June 13th, remains, again, deep and strong in cyber and any other field. With the United States, we are, from my mind, the ultimate alliance. Have a good conference. Bye-bye.